Well, thanks so much for joining us. I'm Jonathan Armstrong at Cordery, the compliance law specialist. I'm delighted to say Eric Sinrod is with us again, and we're going to look at what we have done previously on our podcasts of picking 3 trends or cases or developments that we think people should look out for in 2021. Now, as is the tradition over whatever it is, 6 or 7 or 8 or maybe more years now, Eric, we don't tell each other in advance. So we might end up with just 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. But why don't you shoot first with your first prediction/trend?
It's interesting. I was just thinking this morning, how many years have we been doing this? And I believe we started in either 2011 or 2012. We're going strong. We're pushing toward number 300. That being said, yes, let's talk about our predictive trends for this particular year of 2021. Hard to believe we're in 2021. Mm-hmm. So my first topic is different than one that I've prognosticated in the past, and that is cybercrime. I mean, we're aware of cybercrime in terms of hacking and those types of things, and that's been in the news for a while. But we've had some pretty big recent developments here in the United States, including an insurrection and violence at our nation's capital in my hometown of Washington, D.C., where I'm from originally, 2 weeks ago, I believe today. Today, by the way, in terms of the broadcast, is the day before our inauguration. Today's the 19th. It's happening tomorrow. And so much of the organizational effort took place online on various platforms. And there was the organization. Ahead of that, there was all sorts of dissemination of information that wasn't correct. But we've been told that there have been efforts to have even more violence tomorrow at the inauguration. As a consequence, we have 25,000 National Guard troops there. And on the Mall of Washington, it's pretty much cleared out of the public. We've been warned of violent protests at the different state capitals around the country. And, this organizational effort wouldn't really be possible in a large way, but for the internet. So going forward, we're going to have to think about, how we thwart cybercrime, and what are legitimate efforts to do that, and what are efforts that might be otherwise infringing on people's rights to communicate and assemble online. So that's a long-winded way of saying cybercrime, Jonathan. That's my number 1.
Yeah, well, that was going to be my number 2, so I'll switch the order slightly, and I've come at, I guess, the same issue from a slightly different angle. I mean, we've experienced the same issues as you have with rioting in the UK that's been coordinated by WhatsApp and other messaging services in the past. And now, of course, in terms of your insurrection via open Facebook groups, etc. But my take on cybercrime was slightly different, where certainly the back end of the year, we saw quite a lot of attacks that were, in some respects, COVID relevant. So CEO fraud, getting people to pay invoices when they knew that people weren't just across the hallway to check face-to-face. People tend to pay invoices and do more silly things when they're sat at home and they feel isolated. But also one trend that I think I'm seeing is what I'm calling cyber mercenaries. So you and I have talked before about big nation-state hacking gangs, and we could probably name a number of countries where they have these colleges for cyber criminals on a enormous scale. And I've always had a worry and a theory that some of those state operatives could move into the private sector once they realized that they had skills that were only being paid 20 groats a month in the service of the state, but they could operate almost as pirates on the cyber high seas and do the bidding of gangs, whether that be financed by drugs gangs, whether that be financed by the Nigerian phishing scammers that we've come across in our professional lives in the past. And I think I'm starting to see that with things like ransomware. You know, we've looked at one mode of attack that's almost like Tupperware parties, that you've got one group that creates the goods, in this case, the ransomware, and then it distributes it to home-based groups that then use that exploit to extort money from people. And I think we're going to see more sophisticated versions of that. I think it's truly difficult to deal with gangs like that because you're playing whack-a-mole. But my other big prediction at the end of that is what I'm calling cyber shorting. So you might have heard it here first, Eric. And what I mean by that is I think stocks and shares for some businesses have been very volatile, again, partly because of the pandemic. And share prices move quite considerably on news of a cyber attack. So it's relatively simple, I think, for these gangs to use the same techniques as ransomware to extract data from an organization and then to publish it to prove that they have documents that are indicative of a data breach with that corporation. The result of that, of course, is likely to drop share price by 6 or 7 or 8%. And that's how the gang can get their pay, if you like, because they can trade shares on the basis of that stock drop. So I think it's going to be a tough year for cybercrime as well, and particularly as we see these nation-state hackers move into the private sector.
Okay, thank you. All right, let's move on to the next tier. When I teach tech law at my universities, I say, students, if you remember one law when you leave this course, or one provision of law, it's Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And of course, we've talked about that before, but it's bubbled up again. So just as a reminder to our viewers/listeners, Section 230 was enacted in 1996 by our Congress. And the intent was we wanted to have a very vibrant, growing internet that would benefit the US economy. So in sum and substance, it basically says that if you're an internet service provider, you don't have responsibility or potential legal liability for third-party content posted by others on your sites. And it would be very difficult practically to do that anyway. Fast forward to now, these companies are now some of the biggest companies in the world. By God, they really have flourished, like your Facebooks and your Twitters, et cetera, right? But then there was growing concern when we had the 2016 election, and there was all sorts of false and misleading information posted on sites like Facebook and others that were designed to affect the outcome of our election. Okay, so there was that. Now we're in a world where these websites are used actively by leaders. And our current president, as of this day, tomorrow a different president, of course, has used Twitter tremendously, many times a day throughout his presidency to communicate his messages. But there came a point where there was concern. But for a while, some of his posts were flagged as not necessarily being accurate when it came to the pandemic. But then there were great concerns that his posts would contribute to the violence and frankly, the insurrection that was happening in Washington, and maybe some subsequent violence leading up to, including after our inauguration. So Twitter basically suspended the president's account so he couldn't communicate there. And then Facebook did that for a time afterwards as well. And there have been some who've said that was a good thing because we're in such a perilous climate. We can't have anything that's throwing gasoline on the flames. And others said, well, hold on, you can't cancel speech like that. Some have raised the idea that it violates the First Amendment, but of course, these are private companies. They're not the government. They have their terms of service. And arguably, if the terms of service say, if you're engaging in speech on our sites that could lead to violence and harm like that, we can take you down. But we're now sort of going into uncharted territories, because if these internet service providers can start becoming the referees of content, and these companies are now so ubiquitous to not be able to communicate on them, to not be able to play there, you really are being sort of taken out of the mainstream, if you will, or maybe the mainstream is not the right word, but the main modes of communication. Now, clearly, if the president wanted to, he could just go up to his lectern and cameras would come around, or he could deliver speeches or have press conferences, but this is the way he's done business. So I think there's going to be quite a bit of examination going forward in terms of how speech is monitored on these internet service providers. And as I talked about, I think perhaps on our last video podcast, it might not be the frontest burner issue given the pandemic and the political strife and whatnot, but certainly during these next 4 years in the first term of the Biden administration, I think it will deserve a look. So that's my number 2. How about you?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I'd predicted that prediction. It seems to me that there are all sorts of challenges when you come to removing people from Twitter, and I would predict, I think, that there'll be calls for all sorts of people to be removed with views that people don't like on, I don't know, things like gender, on other nation states, things like the Uyghur Muslim issues that many people are concerned about at the moment. So I suspect it's going to be a year of much debate over content on social media. My number 2, in some respects, is similar to yours, really. I think it's going to be a year of many challenges for big tech across the board. I think that the whole censorship/platform debate that you've discussed eloquently is one facet of that. But I think we're also coming to this realization, and we've discussed it before. I know, for example, after I had this discussion with Max Schrems, that there's this increasing realization that there's, if you like, a triangle of compliance with competition antitrust law, data protection, data privacy law, and fair trade type issues. And that's increasingly becoming politicized as well. You know, there are some in the EU who want to resist what they see as the dominance of US-based suppliers. President Trump, for example, has tried to resist the operation of TikTok in the US with similar concerns about the dominance of the Chinese state potentially in the US. And I think that we're bound to hit these type of issues, particularly as one political party feels less favored, or that another political party has been more favored. So I think the more we enter into this censorship platform debate, the more we see issues in other spheres like antitrust, like privacy regulation, and also, as I say, allegations that different platforms have been assisting corrupt regimes and should be banned as a result. So I see challenges for big tech right across the board, because I don't think it's as simple as you know, the Chinese government, for example, shrugging their shoulders and saying, yeah, TikTok took one for the team. I invented my own tongue twister there.
Say that one 10 times fast.
That's right. I think that we're undoubtedly going to see different governments pile on in support of their preferred big tech corporation. And I think we're going to see that, you know, not only in the social media space, but also in, you know, Cisco versus, I always pronounce it wrongly, Huawei, and all of these debates at the very root of the technology infrastructure, as well as in the public-facing pieces on social media.
Well said, well said. And some of what you said, and I love that tongue twister now. I can't wait till I hear that one back. But you did it well. It was very alliterative. But part of what you said anticipates what I'm going to address now. And frankly, for my number 3, I have a tie, if that's okay, but I'll try to be succinct.
Yeah.
one of my tied items for number 3 is antitrust, and we touched on that a bit last time. Big tech has become humongous tech, and there are investigatory efforts about potentially seeking on a governmental basis to break up some of these companies. Like, for example, do you spin off, WhatsApp from Facebook, that type of thing. So that was very succinct. My other one for number 3 is different, and that is the whole notion of going back to work. As we maybe get a handle on this pandemic, we still have a long way to go. Fortunately, the vaccines are rolling out. I know it's been hard for you in your country with that variant of COVID that's much more contagious. We're having it. California might be like the epicenter of COVID in the world, at least Southern California. But at some point, there's going to be the opportunity to go back to work in person, and maybe even the directive to go back to work. And what happens when the world isn't completely safe from a disease standpoint, but somewhat safer, and employers are saying, we need you to show up. Now, some employers are saying to themselves, wow, you know what, this remote working is favorable, or it's certainly acceptable. And if people want to work from home, that's lower overhead. We don't have to house them in an office place, good on you. But some employers might want employees to show up, and employees might be reticent to go to work, and they might want to stay at home and work remotely. And that's where there could be some lawsuits and some legal action. So that's my tie for number 3, antitrust, and also, the hybrid work situation, and whether there are going to be disputes between employees and employers about where they actually work from. How about you?
Yeah, no, I agree with that, and I think it's an issue already. And I know of one possible case, exactly to your point, on a forced return to work where the employee didn't think it was safe. My last one, predictably, is the whole data protection, data transfer, GDPR bit. So a bumper year for GDPR in many respects, and of course we now talk about almost GDPRs, because we've got EU GDPR and UK GDPR, but a bumper year for GDPRs. 272 million euros of GDPR fines in the EU, and about 40 million sterling in the UK. So a significant year in terms of enforcement. But I think the bit that people will be really scratching their heads over in 2021 is the whole data transfer piece. So the question, I guess, on most people's lips tomorrow is how high a priority is fixing Privacy Shield for the Biden administration, and can Joe fix it? So I think the answer to that is not very high, and probably not. I think there could be some sort of a temporary fix, and there is already some overtures, I think, between the incoming administration and the commission about some, Privacy Shield 2, Safe Harbor 3, call it what you will. But I don't think that survives a lasting challenge unless and until the US changes its domestic law. But I think we'll also see challenges with standard contractual clauses, the other method of transferring data across the Atlantic. The EDPB had a new pronouncement on that today, which I think is somewhat unhelpful to transfers across the Atlantic. And of course, we've got this whole complexity of Brexit as well there. So I foresee that UK to US transfers should be less problematical than EU to US transfers. And we've got a 4-month deal potentially for UK to EU and vice versa. But that's a deal that I don't think is necessarily a lasting deal. It can be extended for 2 months, and it can be sort of made semi-permanent if the UK gets an adequacy decision from the EU. But those things aren't a given either. So I think for most organizations, they're really going to have to sit down and give some hard thought in January and February to all of their data transfers. And of course, this gets back into some of the political aspects that we've discussed before about things like data localization, about the Chinese authorities and the Russian authorities wanting data or copies of data retained on their soil. The French have had data export laws for many years. Switzerland has as well. So we're trying to do business on a global basis, but increasingly there's a sort of localization of data. And if data is the oil for modern business, and that could be a exam dissertation for your student body, I think. But if that is right, then we're increasingly seeing that nations holding on to data and trying to localize it whilst talking a good game about the world being global. So I think the whole data transfer piece is going to be a significant tension for businesses for the year ahead.
Well, in close to a year from now, we will look back on these predictions and see how accurate they were. My guess is fairly accurate. How about you?
I think you're right. We've always the advantage on YouTube of deleting the video if we're wrong there, Eric.
No, we wouldn't do that. Well, anyway, thank you for sharing your thoughts. I'm glad I was able to do mine. I'm looking forward to a strong 2021 together as we continue, as we have in the past. I suppose all that remains to say is to thank our viewers for tuning in and to keep informing us of topics you'd like us to cover this year. I'm Eric Sinrod. I can be reached at ejsinrod@dwaynemorris.com. Jonathan, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Eric, and look forward to 2021 as well. And let's hope for a peaceful transition tomorrow. Stay safe, everybody. I'm Jonathan.Armstrong at corderycompliance.com. We'll post our contact details and some notes, etc., just below the screen. And if you want to be kept up to date about future films, then if you hit subscribe, it'll automatically tell you when the next one's out. All that remains is to thank you for watching.